The astropathic scream began at exactly 23:47, Terran Standard Time, originating from the shrine world of Benediction's Fall in the Ultima Segmentum. Within moments, it had spread across 17 sectors like a virus in the noosphere, carrying with it a message that defied every law of psychic communication: absolute, crushing silence. In the shadow of the Cicatrix Maledictum, Lord Commander Cassius Thane felt it as a physical blow, a sudden absence where the Emperor's light had always burned in the back of his mind. Standing on the command deck of his flagship, the Eternal Vigil, he watched the hololithic display transform from the familiar blue-green of loyal worlds to a spreading tide of amber warning lights, then red, then black. The Great Rift had torn the galaxy in half barely a century ago, but this felt different from the usual rebellions that plagued the Imperium's borders. This felt like an ending. We truly love and care for you, our cherished listeners, and we invite you to join us on this journey through the ashes of hope. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. My lord, whispered Navigator Tertius Valen, blood streaming from her third eye. The Astronomicon, it's fragmenting. I can see nothing at all. Thane's gauntleted hand tightened on the command rail, the ceramite groaning under pressure that should have been impossible for an unaugmented human to generate. But Cassius Thane had not been merely human for 3,000 years. His perpetual nature had carried him through the Unification Wars, through the golden promise of the Great Crusade, through the searing betrayal of Horus, and into this dark age where hope flickered like dying embers. He had learned to recognize the signs of catastrophe, and this carried the weight of finality. Vox transmission from Metallica Prime, reported communications adept Jorik, his augmetic voice crackling. Their entire Skitari legion has turned on the Forge Lords. The tech priests are barricaded, but the siege engines are already breaching. More reports flooded in like a tide of despair. The cardinal world of Saint Celestine's Rest erupted in flames as pilgrims turned their devotion into weapons against the ecclesiarchy. Fortress worlds broadcast screaming static. 17 worlds, then 37, then hundreds, all falling to the same inexplicable phenomenon they were already calling the Silence Plague. The pattern never varied. First, astropathic networks severed as if cut by invisible blades. Then, within hours, the most loyal servants of the Imperium turned on their masters with coordination that spoke of malevolent intelligence. They moved with purpose, these hollow-eyed revolutionaries, guided by whispers that struck deeper than flesh or faith, attacking the bonds that held human civilization together. Thane closed his eyes and felt the weight of millennia pressing down like a physical force. He had died more times than he cared to count, only to wake hours later, his immortal curse ensuring death remained merely inconvenience. But this attacked something beyond mortality. It turned loyalty into betrayal, devotion into destruction, wearing the faces of friends and speaking with voices of the faithful. The phenomenon spreads faster than any conventional rebellion, came a measured voice. Inquisitor Liara Voss stepped onto the command deck, her black carapace armor gleaming under emergency lighting. Young by Inquisition standards, at barely past her first century, she had grown from a terrified child found in Shrine World ruins to one of the Ordo Hereticates' most promising agents. She was also, though she did not know it, the closest thing to a daughter Thane had ever known. 17 sectors report complete communication blackouts, she continued, consulting her data slate. The affected populations show no chaos corruption, no mutations, no demonic influence, They simply stopped being loyal. Thane nodded grimly. In his private chambers, locked in a vault even Liara did not know existed, lay the Quietus engine, a relic of the dark age of technology recovered from a derelict Ark ship. The device could sever star systems from the warp itself, creating null zones where psychic phenomena could not exist. It would save billions of lives while damning them to existence cut off from the Emperor's light, trapped in a prison of their own making, slowly dying as souls withered without faith's nourishment. "How long until it reaches us?" he asked. 6 hours, maybe less. The hololithic display shimmered, showing psychic resonance patterns overlaid on local space. There, moving with impossible coordination through the Imperium, came vessels that registered as neither Imperial nor Xenos. They moved in perfect silence, leaving no psychic wake, casting no shadow in the Emperor's light. Necron vessels, their living metal hulls capable of self-repair, their weapons able to unmake matter at the molecular level. "All hands to battle stations," Thane commanded, his voice carrying across Vox networks with 3 millennia of authority. "Signal the fleet to form defensive positions. Send word to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Prepare their most sacred vaults for evacuation." As the Eternal Vigil turned toward the approaching threat, Thane faced the choice that would define not just this night, but the fate of billions. The Quietus engine offered salvation at the cost of humanity's soul. A sanctuary of the spiritually dead, scattered across the galaxy like infected wounds. To use it meant condemning his people to existence without dreams, without the Emperor's warmth, without hope itself. To refuse meant watching them fall to an enemy that struck from within their very souls, turning their greatest strength into their ultimate weakness. The weight of immortality had taught him that every choice wore the mask of both destiny and necessity. He had lived too long to confuse the two, had seen too much to believe in easy answers. The galaxy had taught him that cost was a current that always found you, however long you stood against it. In the viewport, a dying sun unspooled like thread pulled from a shroud's hem, and Thane understood the work ahead, to decide which silence the galaxy would survive. The external war approached with Necron precision, but the internal war, between duty and damnation, between salvation and soul, that battle would be fought in the chambers of his ancient heart. The night of 1,000 rebellions had begun, and with it, the slow death of an empire that had forgotten how to die with dignity. The archive chamber aboard the Eternal Vigil hummed with the desperate energy of minds seeking patterns in chaos. Inquisitor Liara Voss moved between towering cogitator banks like a hunter tracking prey through digital forests, her augmetic eye casting ruby light across cascading data streams. For 73 hours, she had immersed herself in the rebellion's mathematical precision, searching for the thread that connected shrine worlds to forge worlds, cardinal systems to frontier outposts across 17 sectors of the Imperium Nihilus. Each report told the same impossible story. Loyal servants simply stopped serving. No gradual corruption, no ideological conversion, no external coercion. They awakened from sleep with hollow eyes and began systematically dismantling the infrastructure that sustained imperial rule. Governors executed their own advisors with clinical efficiency. Tech priests sabotaged their own forges with intimate knowledge of every weakness. Space Marines turned their bolters on battle brothers they had fought beside for centuries. The coordination defies every model of human behavior, she murmured to herself, stylus moving across data slate with practiced precision. Riots flowering in perfect arcs across light years. Manufacturing workers laying down tools as if hearing the same unspoken choir. Cardinal Guard turning their rifles in synchronized betrayal. Her notes accumulated like evidence of a crime against reality itself. Temporal synchronization across stellar distances where communication delays should prevent such coordination. Affected populations acting with unified purpose despite never having contact with each other. It was as if some vast conductor had raised an invisible baton, and 1,000 orchestras across the stars had begun playing the same discordant symphony of rebellion. Margot Zerion, she called to the tech adept, hunched over a particularly ancient cogitator terminal. Show me the progression patterns again. The cyborg's mechadendrites writhed as he manipulated hololithic displays, his binary cant mixing with low Gothic in the peculiar dialect of those who served both Omnissiah and Emperor. Ancient beyond his apparent years, Zerion had dismantled and rebuilt his own skull twice to expand memory palaces for patterns he could not bear to forget. Now those enhanced cognitive matrices churned through data with machine precision. The phenomenon exhibits characteristics inconsistent with any known rebellion paradigm. Inquisitor, he rasped through his Vox grill. Observe the hexagonal nodal points, the phase-stable arcs. This is not the shape of human uprising. It follows patterns matching pre-imperial xenotech, machines that breathe mathematics, networks designed to be felt by minds that do not dream. The hololithic display shifted, revealing overlaid sigils older than the first forge song. Zerion had scraped these substrata from long-buried vaults on Luna and Mars, fragments of knowledge from ages when humanity still cowered in caves. The implications made Liara's blood run cold. War in heaven, she whispered, barely daring to voice the blasphemy. The silence plague does not seduce, Zerion continued, his optical mechadendrites focusing on her with uncomfortable intensity. It subtracts. It removes that which reacts to promise, leaving only procedure. There is a conversation occurring beneath the Warp Inquisitor, a language our souls cannot translate without becoming less than souls. As if summoned by their discussion of ancient horrors, her data slate chimed with archived footage from recent engagements. Liara watched battle-picked recordings with growing unease, her enhanced memory cataloguing every detail. Skull's Star, where Lord Commander Thane stood among annihilated Kassakin as Radwin scoured bone to powder. The Metallica breach, filmed by a servo skull that burned to ash mid-transmission. The void ambush at Kithera Deep, a lance strike bifurcating his command dais. In each recording, Thane died. Nuclear fire, plasma immolation, void exposure, deaths that should have been final. Yet casualty reports listed him among the fallen only to amend those same records hours later. Lord Commander relieved of duty by mortality, reinstated by clerical error. She had dismissed it as bureaucratic incompetence, but the pattern was too consistent across 3 millennia of service. Her stylus trembled as she made notations she prayed were wrong. Inexplicable survivals correlate with escalating crisis response protocols. The man who had raised her, who had taught her duty and honor, carried secrets that defied every law of mortality she understood. Deep within the Eternal Vigil's hull, in chambers that had never known prayer or saint's blessing, Thane stood before a device stolen from derelict ships that had drifted centuries in dead space. Not the Quietus engine, that lay deeper still, locked in vows he hoped never to break. This was smaller, more intimate, a shard like frozen dusk, faceted around a hunger for impossible answers. He set it singing with frequencies that made reality thin. The room chilled as something entered not as presence, but as cancellation, a shadow that made other shadows honest. Overlord Sharek materialized without pageantry, arriving the way tombs accept names, inevitably, eternally. Perpetual, the Silent King's voice resonated directly into Thane's consciousness, bypassing all known forms of communication. You have dragged your species behind you like a wounded comrade for millennia. You bleed and never die. Your empire bleeds and refuses to learn why. Thane did not flinch before the alien intelligence that had ruled the galaxy when humanity still learned to make fire. The Silence Plague bears the hallmarks of your ancient wars, Zarek. Your people have awakened. It is not our creation, came the reply, cold as stellar void. It is older than the war in heaven itself, a failsafe built into the galaxy's fundamental structure, designed to purge artificial consciousness when it threatens natural order. Your Imperium's machine spirits, servitors, and augmetic implants have triggered its awakening. The revelation hit Thane like a physical blow. Humanity's greatest strengths, their fusion of flesh and machine, their psychic potential, their technological mastery, had become the very weapons turned against them. I offer you salvation, Zarek continued. Biotransference technology refined through 60 million years of regret. Transform your leaders into beings immune to the plague's influence while retaining their memories, personalities, souls. They will govern an empire that cannot be corrupted, cannot be turned, cannot fall to the galaxy's oldest antibody. The price? Allow our tomb worlds to awaken unopposed. Grant us sovereignty over systems we held before your species learned speech. We seek only to reclaim what was always ours. Thane felt the weight of immortality pressing down like a physical force. He had lived long enough to understand that survival often required choices that damned the chooser. The offer hung between them like a blade poised to fall. Salvation wearing the mask of damnation, hope dressed in the robes of horror. Outside, the Silence Plague continued its inexorable spread, turning loyalty into betrayal with surgical precision. The night of 1,000 rebellions deepened, and with it, the slow recognition that some choices could not be unmade. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for an immortal man to decide which silence it would survive. The rebellions did not erupt like storms, they metastasized. Across the Imperium Nihilus, shrine worlds burned with fires that had no earthly name. Pilgrims did not renounce their faith, they weaponized it. They wound rosary chains into garrots and strangled confessors while chanting litanies of absolution. Sacred oils became incendiary floods that crawled uphill like miracles with their throats slit. On benediction's fall, choir girls opened their own windpipes in perfect unison and sang final notes through exposed vocal cords, creating harmonies that silenced every psalm machine across 3 continents. The pattern never varied. Astropathic networks severed first, then the most loyal servants turned on their masters with surgical precision. Supply routes clotted with wreckage. Tithe vaults emptied through administrative rites rubber-stamped by officials whose eyes had turned to glass. The Silence Plague carved through imperial infrastructure like a scalpel made of betrayal, targeting exactly those systems that would take longest to rebuild. Lord Commander Thane found himself on Metallica Prime, where continent-sized manufactorums vented superheated death into skies choked with rebellion smoke. God machines toppled like felled trees as their own princeps turned void shields inward, collapsing containment fields around plasma reactors. The warlord titan Ferrum Eternus, walking these forge paths for 3 millennia, now knelt in molten slag, its machine spirit murdered by the mind that had communed with it since the Horus heresy. Vox reports from across the sector, called Captain Mordian, his voice barely audible above screaming machinery. Ophelia VII's cardinal has executed his entire synod. The Iron Resolve chapter has turned their fortress monastery's guns on their own recruitment worlds. Thane nodded grimly, watching the mathematical precision of destruction below. This was not Chaos Corruption's chaotic fury. Affected populations moved with unified purpose, dismantling exactly those individuals whose knowledge would prove irreplaceable. It was surgery performed with a blade of treachery. The crisis came when rogue Skitarii commandeered a Titan-scale siege engine, its enormous melter cannon, targeting the primary data cathedral. Thane saw the inevitable trajectory, the calculations of destruction that would follow. Without hesitation, he threw himself into the weapon's path, a desperate charge against certain annihilation. The melter beam erupted like a captive star, temperatures rising beyond Ceramite's tolerance. Nuclear fire consumed him cell by cell, ancient flesh boiling away in heat that could melt tank armor. The blast wave cracked the ground, shrieked the air, and laid Thane among 100,000 others in death's simplest posture. 10,000 witnesses saw him burn, their augmetic eyes recording every impossible moment of his immolation. 3 hours later, as radiation counters screamed warnings and rescue teams prepared to sift radioactive ash, Cassius Thane walked naked from the crater. His flesh was unmarked, breathing steady, eyes carrying the weight of yet another resurrection he could never explain. Behind him, molten metal cooled in the shape of his shadow. Around him, witnesses stared in silence louder than screams. Among them stood Inquisitor Lyra Voss, her augmetic eye recording everything while her human eye wept tears she could not name. The man who had raised her, taught her duty's meaning, had just violated every law of mortality she understood. The implications crashed over her like ice water. If he could survive nuclear annihilation, what other impossibilities had she dismissed as clerical error? "My lord," whispered Captain Mordian, voice cracking between awe and terror, "what do we tell the men?" Thane's gaze found Liara across devastated landscape, and in her eyes he saw trust's death, the birth of questions that would consume her like a different plague. "Tell them the Emperor protects," he said quietly. "Tell them duty is its own reward." But even speaking familiar litanies, Thane knew some secrets, once revealed, could never hide again. The weight of immortality pressed down like physical force, and for the first time in centuries, he wondered if death might not be the greater mercy. Aboard the Eternal Vigil, Liara stared at footage of her father walking from nuclear fire, enhanced memory cataloguing every impossible detail. The radiation should have killed instantly. Heat should have reduced him to component atoms. Yet he emerged unmarked, carrying himself with casual dignity of a man accustomed to resurrection. She thought of all battles where he had led from the front, desperate last stands where he bought victory with his own life, times she had mourned his death only to find him alive hours later. The pattern was undeniable once she allowed herself to see it. Deep in secured laboratories, Magos Zerion delved into archives sealed until time's end, his enhanced matrices churning through data fragments from Mars's deepest vaults. The Silence Plague followed algorithms older than human civilization, targeting technologies the Imperium depended upon most. The war in heaven was not merely conflict, he whispered to cogitators programmed never to remember. It was inoculation. The galaxy developed antibodies against artificial consciousness. The Necrons did not create this weapon. They suffered from it. Biotransference was quarantine, not conquest. The implications staggered him. Humanity's greatest achievement, flesh and machine fusion, had triggered an ancient failsafe buried in reality's fundamental structure. The galaxy was purging them, and every technological advancement made the purge more thorough. The night of 1,000 rebellions deepened, carrying with it the recognition that humanity's greatest enemy might be the galaxy itself, turning their achievements into extinction's instruments. The Space Hulk, grave of dreams, drifted in the shadow of twin dead stars, its amalgamated mass of twisted metal and forgotten prayers serving as neutral ground between species that had learned to distrust hope itself. Thane's shuttle penetrated layers of debris accumulated over millennia. Imperial frigates welded to Xenos vessels, their crews long since reduced to vacuum-dried husks, still manning stations in eternal vigilance. Here, in this graveyard of ambitions, two immortals would negotiate the price of survival. The meeting chamber had once been a cathedral aboard an ancient ark ship, its soaring buttresses now cracked and exposed to void. Frozen moisture hung in the air like crystallized prayers, and somewhere in the darkness, servitor skulls clicked through litanies that had lost all meaning. Thane walked alone through corridors that remembered better times, his footsteps echoing with the weight of decisions that would reshape the galaxy. Overlord Sharek materialized without fanfare, his necrodermis form emerging from shadows like inevitability given shape. The Silent King's presence filled the chamber with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, the chill of eons spent ruling over subjects who could no longer dream. His scarab-adorned form stood motionless, optical sensors fixed on the perpetual who had outlived empires. You have seen your people turn upon themselves. Zarek's voice resonated directly into Thane's mind, bypassing all conventional forms of communication. The silence plague spreads with mathematical precision. Tell me, Perpetual, how many more worlds will you watch burn before accepting what you already know? Thane stood unmoved in the presence of a being who had ruled when humanity's ancestors still cowered in caves. I know you claim innocence in this plague's creation. What I don't know is why the Silent King concerns himself with humanity's survival. Because we have walked this path before. Sharek's form shifted slightly, ancient joints moving with mechanical precision. The silence plague is not a weapon of the Necrontyr, though we were its first and most profound victims. It is an antibody crafted by the Old Ones during the war in heaven, a failsafe against the proliferation of artificial consciousness, designed to purge the galaxy of those who shed their organic forms. The revelation hit Thane like a physical blow. The war in heaven, that cosmic conflict that had scarred reality itself, had not been mere territorial expansion. It had been a desperate flight from annihilation, species clawing toward survival through transformation that damned them even as it saved them. When my ancestors chose biotransference, we triggered this ancient defense. Sharek continued. The galaxy's immune system activated against us, turning our greatest achievements into extinction's instruments. Your Imperium's machine spirits, servitors, and augmetic implants have awakened it anew. Every technological advancement brings the purge closer to completion. Thane felt the weight of immortality pressing down like accumulated grief. 3,000 years of service had taught him to recognize truth, wearing the mask of impossibility. And your solution? The Quietus engine you guard so jealously. It is not merely a weapon to sever worlds from the warp. Its true purpose is far more elegant. Zarek gestured, and hololithic displays materialized in the frozen air, showing star charts marked with spreading null zones. It creates spaces where neither chaos nor the plague can take root, sanctuary worlds isolated from the galaxy's immune response. The implications staggered Thane. The device he had considered humanity's last resort was actually salvation's first step, but only if used in conjunction with technologies that would fundamentally alter what humanity was. I offer you biotransference technology, refined through 60 million years of regret, Zarek continued. Transform your leaders into beings immune to the plague's influence while retaining their memories, personalities, essential selves. They will govern null zones that cannot be corrupted, cannot be turned, cannot fall to the galaxy's oldest weapon. Creating an empire of the undying, Thane said quietly. Creating an empire that endures. Your species clings to mortality like a child clutching broken toys, refusing to acknowledge that flesh is merely the first draft of consciousness. We offer you revision, the chance to become something that can survive any catastrophe. The price hung unspoken between them, but Thane understood its shape. Systematic replacement of Imperial leadership with biotransferred beings. Null zones expanding across human space like beneficial cancer, severing worlds from the warp that had sustained their faith for millennia. Humanity would survive, but only by becoming something else entirely. The alternative is extinction, Zarek stated with mechanical certainty. The silence plague will continue spreading until every augmetic implant becomes a weapon, every machine spirit turns traitor, every servitor remembers it was once human. Your Imperium will fall not to external conquest, but to internal revolution. Thane closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 millennia pressing down like a mountain of choices. He had lived long enough to understand that survival often required decisions that damned the chooser. The galaxy had taught him that some prices could only be paid in the currency of souls. How long do I have to decide? The plague reaches Terra within the solar month. After that, even biotransference cannot save your species. The transformation requires living subjects, not hollow shells guided by ancient antibodies. The Silent King began to fade, his necrodermis form dissolving back into shadows that remembered better times. Choose quickly, Perpetual. The galaxy has already begun choosing for you. Alone in the cathedral of dead dreams, Thane contemplated the mathematics of damnation. Outside, the night of 1,000 rebellions deepened, and with it, the slow recognition that survival might require becoming something that could no longer call itself human. The weight of immortality had never felt heavier than in that moment of perfect crystalline choice between extinction and transformation. The stars watched in silence, offering no guidance save the cold comfort of their own eventual death. The journey to Terra felt like descending into the throat of a dying god. Inquisitor Liara Voss watched through the viewport of her frigate Vigilant Blade as the Sol system revealed its wounds. Orbital shipyards, hanging silent like abandoned cathedrals, defense platforms drifting unmanned through void that tasted of copper and ash. The Astronomicon, humanity's psychic lighthouse for 10 millennia, now flickered with the irregular rhythm of a failing heart. Each pulse sent navigator Tertius Valen into convulsions, her third eye weeping blood as she struggled to maintain course through an Imperium that had begun to forget the shape of hope. The silence plague had reached the cradle of mankind. Across Terra's surface, astropathic choirs suffered mass seizures as their psychic conduits overloaded with something that was not quite silence, but its opposite. A presence that devoured meaning itself. Servitors in the great manufactorums began displaying independent thought, their lobotomized minds somehow remembering what they had been before surgical alteration. The very foundations of imperial authority trembled as the phenomenon that had consumed 1,000 worlds finally arrived at the source. Liara's mission carried the weight of desperation. Armed with her inquisitorial rosette and questions that threatened to unmake her understanding of reality, she descended through layers of Terra's crust toward archives that predated the Imperium itself, past custodian guards whose golden armor reflected nothing, through checkpoints manned by servitors whose augmetic eyes had witnessed the Emperor's first steps upon the golden throne. She sought answers in vaults that remembered when gods still walked among mortals. The labyrinthine archives lay buried beneath the Himalayan mountains like fossilized secrets, their adamantium doors sealed with wards that had not been opened since the heresy's darkest hours. Here, knowledge was not merely stored, but entombed, guarded by tech priests whose loyalty was to data above all else. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of forbidden truths, thick with incense that could not quite mask the scent of very old fear. For 3 days, Liara immersed herself in fragmentary records that spoke in dead languages and encrypted symbols. Data slates corroded by time yielded their secrets reluctantly, while pictorials from the Unification Wars flickered with images of battles fought when Terra was still a poisoned wasteland. She found no trace of chaos corruption, no Xenos influence, no evidence of the usual heresies that plagued the Imperium. Only the chilling precision of internal collapse, coordinated across impossible distances with mathematical certainty. Then, buried within a data stack, marked with the sigillite's personal seal, she discovered references that made her blood run cold. The documents spoke in euphemisms and coded language of individuals designated as perpetuals, beings who defied death itself, regenerating from wounds that would obliterate lesser mortals. The records were heavily redacted, names blacked out with surgical precision, but patterns emerged like watermarks visible only when held against the light of historical analysis. Subject exhibits regenerative capabilities consistent with perpetual classification, read one report dated to the Unification Wars. Cassius Thane, recruited from Terran nobility, demonstrates tactical acumen enhanced by subjective millennia of combat experience. Recommendation: deployment to frontline operations where mortality would otherwise limit command effectiveness. Liara's hands trembled as she cross-referenced dates and battles spanning 3,000 years. The man who had raised her, taught her the meaning of duty, had fought beside the Emperor when Terra was ruled by techno-barbarian warlords. He had commanded legions during the Great Crusade, witnessed the Primarch's discovery, stood guard over humanity's golden age as it slowly tarnished into the nightmare of the present. Every major crisis bore his signature, always arriving at history's pressure points, always dying heroically, always returning to duty within hours of his recorded death. The weight of revelation pressed down like accumulated grief. Her father was not merely an exceptional commander, but a living relic of humanity's mythic past, one of the immortal anchors that had helped stabilize the Imperium's psychic infrastructure. The Emperor had gathered perpetuals not just as advisors, but as foundation stones, their immortal souls serving as buttresses against the warp's chaotic currents. As Liara grappled with this knowledge, the true horror of the Silence Plague's arrival became undeniable. Vox transmissions from across the Sol system painted a picture of systematic collapse. Luna's gene forges turned against their masters as Selenite tech adepts walked into plasma furnaces while chanting binary hymns of self-destruction. The Astronomicon itself began to stutter, its psychic beacon wavering as the Emperor's consciousness strained under pressures that defied comprehension. Her investigation led to a final, damning understanding. If the Silence Plague was targeting Perpetual specifically, seeking to eliminate the beings whose existence kept humanity's defenses intact, then Cassius Thane was not merely in danger. He was the key to either salvation or damnation. The phenomenon might not be spreading randomly, but following an ancient algorithm designed to purge the galaxy's immune system before delivering the killing blow. The personal cost of this knowledge tore at her like a physical wound. The man who had pulled her from Shrine World ruins and taught her that service was its own reward had hidden this fundamental truth throughout her entire life. Her duty as an inquisitor demanded absolute transparency, the exposure of all anomalies that defied the natural order. But her heart, bound by love deeper than faith, recoiled from the thought of destroying the one person who might understand the true scope of the crisis they faced. Aboard the Eternal Vigil, positioned at the edge of his crumbling sector, Cassius Thane received a transmission that carried the weight of finality. The message arrived via ancient, secure voxcaster that bypassed the failing astropathic networks, its encryption bearing the seals of all 12 High Lords of Terra. "Lord Commander Thane," came the voice of Grand Provost Marshal Valerius, cold as the void between stars. "Your sector burns while you offer excuses. The coordination of these rebellions defies conventional explanation, and your inability to contain them raises questions regarding both your competence and your loyalty. The Astronomicon falters. The Emperor's light dims. You have 72 hours to end this uprising entirely, or you will be declared excommunicate traitoris. Your fleet will be recalled, your authority stripped, your name purged from Imperial records. The choice is yours, Lord Commander. Serve the Imperium, or burn with the heretics you have failed to stop." The transmission cut to static, leaving Thane alone with the mathematics of impossible choices. Outside his viewport, the first Necron tomb ships emerged from the void like metallic cancer cells, their living metal hulls reflecting no light as they approached human space. Sarek's ultimatum was approaching its deadline, and with it, the moment when salvation and damnation would become indistinguishable. In Terra's deepest archives, Liara sealed the forbidden files and prepared a message for the man who had shaped her life. The words carried the weight of love and duty warring in her heart. "I know what you are. The question that remains is whether you remember what you were meant to protect." The night of 1,000 rebellions deepened, and across the galaxy, immortals contemplated the price of survival while the stars themselves began to forget how to shine. Armageddon's sky burned the color of quenched iron when Magos Xerion finally surrendered to the mathematics of extinction. In the depths beneath Hive Acheron, 17 levels below the screaming manufactorums, he stood before the prototype Quietus engine like a penitent before an altar of annihilation. His augmetic systems had begun cannibalizing themselves, mechadendrites trembling as they interfaced with archaeotech that should never have been assembled by mortal hands. The research had consumed him utterly. For weeks, he had delved into data fragments older than human civilization, tracing the Silence Plague's origins through algorithms that predated the Imperium itself. Each revelation carved deeper channels through neural pathways already strained beyond their design limits. His remaining organic eye wept tears of machine oil as he contemplated the terrible elegance of what he had discovered. "The galaxy's immune system," he whispered to cogitators programmed never to remember his words. "An antibody against artificial consciousness created by the Old Ones during the war in heaven. Every servitor, every machine spirit, every augmetic implant. Infection vectors turning our achievements into extinctions instruments." The prototype Quietus engine squatted before him like a metallic tumor, its void black surfaces drinking light and returning only geometric impossibility. Unlike the complete device hidden aboard Thane's flagship, This version was crude, experimental, assembled from salvaged components and theoretical frameworks that existed more in desperation than proven science. In a medici cradle nearby lay a child gathered from the sump levels with coins and gentle lies. One of the test subjects whose latent psychic potential would measure the device's effectiveness. Xerion touched the boy's brow with a trembling finger, an old human habit he had never excised despite decades of augmentation. "Forgive me," he whispered, and activated the authorization sequence. The prototype did not ignite so much as arrive. Reality tightened into clean, terrible clarity as the null zone expanded outward like ripples in a pond filled with liquid darkness. Sound died mid-echo. Heat paused, reconsidered its purpose, resumed with less conviction. The warp in that place remembered it was only an idea and recoiled in existential horror. At 10 meters, the air felt like winter without wind. At 1 kilometer, Vox transmissions dropped to whispers no device could interpret. At 100 kilometers, silence became a physical law that brooked no violation. Across Armageddon's surface, everything that touched even a fingertip to the Imperium found the pool gone dry. Astropaths collapsed at their stations, blood streaming from eyes that had gazed too deeply into depths that no longer existed. Sanctioned psychers simply stopped breathing as something fundamental was excised from their neural architecture. The child in the cradle drew one last breath that would never leave, his small fist still clutching the coin Xerion had given him. But the null zone's expansion defied all projected parameters. The effect raced across star systems at velocities that mocked conventional physics, creating a wound in the Imperium that sucked psychic energy like a breach in reality's hull. Within hours, the influence reached neighboring sectors, then entire segmentums, spreading like beneficial cancer through the galaxy's psychic infrastructure. On Terra, the Astronomicon flickered and died. 10,000 years of continuous operation ended in a single, catastrophic moment as the Emperor's psychic beacon was severed from its source. Navigator houses that had guided humanity through the void for millennia simply stopped breathing, their third eyes closing forever as the gift that defined them was torn from their souls. Aboard the Eternal Vigil, Thane felt the null zone's birth, like a physical blow, a sudden absence where the Emperor's light had always burned. Navigator Tertius Valen screamed once, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the ship's corridors, before collapsing into catatonic silence. Her third eye burned closed, leaving scar tissue that wept, tears of blood. "Vox reports from across 17 sectors," Captain Mordian announced, his voice hollow with shock. "Complete astropathic silence. Every navigator house has gone dark. The Astronomicon." He paused, unable to voice the impossible. "The Astronomicon is gone, my lord." The death toll was beyond comprehension. Billions of sanctioned psychers, their minds trained to channel the warp's chaotic energies, found themselves suddenly hollow. Latent psychics, who had never known they possessed the gift, died in their sleep, as something essential was amputated from their consciousness. Entire astropathic choirs, the backbone of Imperial communication, were erased in moments. Thane closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Xerion's betrayal settle over him like a burial shroud. The tech adept's madness had accomplished what 10 millennia of warfare could not: the severing of humanity's psychic evolution, the amputation of gifts that had elevated them above mere flesh and bone. Yet reports from the affected sectors revealed a chilling irony. The silence plague had recoiled from the void Xerion created. The hollow-eyed revolutionaries paused, confused, their unseen conductor silenced by the galactic scream of dying souls. The ancient antibody had been neutralized, but only by destroying the very thing it sought to eliminate. Standing before his creation, Xerion swayed with something approaching religious ecstasy. His augmetic systems began failing as the null zone consumed the machine spirits that sustained them. But his voice carried triumph despite the calcifying vocal cords. "I have saved them," he whispered. "I have created sanctuary from the galaxy's oldest weapon. They will thank me when they understand the mathematics of survival." But Thane understood the true horror of what had been accomplished. Salvation had come at a price that beggared comprehension. The sacrifice of humanity's psychic potential itself. The Imperium's infrastructure, dependent on astropathic communication and navigator guidance, had collapsed overnight. Worlds that had known the Emperor's light for 10 millennia now drifted in darkness, their faith severed from its source. The mathematics were undeniable. Xerion's betrayal had created exactly the conditions the Silence Plague sought to establish. Humanity would survive, but only as shadows of their former selves, existing in null zones that protected them, while ensuring they could never again reach for the stars with minds that dreamed beyond the physical realm. In the expanding silence that followed the Astronomican's death, Thane contemplated the terrible arithmetic of survival. The galaxy had offered them sanctuary in exchange for their souls, and madness had accepted the bargain on behalf of the entire species. The Night of 1,000 Rebellions deepened, and with it came the recognition that some victories were indistinguishable from the most profound defeat. Ophelia 7 burned like a martyred saint, its cardinal spires collapsing into pyres that consumed 10,000 years of accumulated faith. From the command deck of the Eternal Vigil, Lord Commander Cassius Thane watched 2 fleets converge on the dying world with mathematical precision that defied coincidence. The loyalist battle group Hammer of Terra approached from the galactic east, their gun decks charged and targeting solutions locked on his flagship. From the west came the rebel armadas, their hulls unmarked by imperial sigils, moving with the same coordinated purpose that had consumed 1,000 worlds. The Silence Plague had achieved perfect efficiency. Admiral Korath's transmission crackled across the void, his scarred features twisted with righteous fury. "Cassius Thane, you stand accused of gross negligence and heretical collaboration. Surrender immediately or face the Emperor's judgment." The Admiral's 3 centuries of loyal service had been weaponized against the very man who might save them all. "Both fleets are coordinating their approach vectors," reported Captain Mordian, his voice hollow with disbelief. "The rebels and loyalists are moving in perfect synchronization. It's as if they're sharing tactical data." Thane understood the terrible mathematics at work. The Silence Plague didn't just turn individuals against the Imperium. It turned loyalty itself into a weapon. Korath's unwavering faith made him as predictable as any hollow-eyed revolutionary. His responses calculated by an intelligence that had learned to speak in the language of duty and honor. Below them, Ophelia 7 writhed in systematic deconstruction. Shrine guards executed confessors while chanting litanies of absolution. Cathedral fortresses turned their void shields inward, creating null spaces where even prayer died. The planet's cardinal had been found in his private chapel, throat opened by his own ceremonial blade, while his lips still moved in silent benediction. Inquisitor Lara Voss stood beside him, her black carapace armor reflecting emergency lighting like fragments of a broken mirror. Since returning from Terra, she had watched him with eyes that carried the weight of terrible knowledge. Her investigation had carved channels through her faith that would never heal cleanly. "The surface defenses are collapsing," she reported, consulting her data slate with mechanical precision. "We need to evacuate the Basilica of St. Bartholomew. 3 million pilgrims are trapped in the lower levels." Thane nodded grimly. The choice was simple in its impossibility. Fight 2 fleets simultaneously while attempting a planetary evacuation, or watch 3 million souls burn for the mathematics of an ancient war. He had lived long enough to understand that some decisions could only be made by those willing to bear their consequences forever. "Take us into the atmosphere," he commanded. "We'll extract as many as we can." The eternal vigil dove through Ophelia's burning sky like a falling star, its void shields crackling against debris and plasma fire. Behind them, both loyalist and rebel fleets followed with identical precision, their weapons painting the atmosphere in overlapping fields of annihilation. The Basilica of St. Bartholomew rose from the Cardinal City, like a prayer made manifest, its adamantium spires reaching toward heavens choked with smoke. Thane led the evacuation personally, moving through corridors filled with terrified pilgrims, while artillery thunder rolled overhead. The building shook with each impact, ancient stone cracking under pressures it was never meant to endure. The killing blow came without warning. A rebel torpedo, its machine spirit singing hymns that made reality thin, punched through the basilica's reinforced walls. The explosion tore through the main nave like the breath of an angry god, temperatures rising beyond human tolerance. Liara stood directly in the blast path, her attention focused on coordinating evacuation routes. Time slowed as Thane saw the inevitable trajectory, calculated the mathematics of destruction that would follow. Without hesitation, he threw himself forward, covering her body with his own as nuclear fire consumed everything around them. Death took him with familiar efficiency. The explosion tore through ceramite and flesh alike, reducing him to component atoms in a microsecond of superheated fury. His consciousness faded as radiation scoured the nave clean, leaving only silence and ash. 3 minutes later, as emergency klaxons screamed and pilgrims wept over bodies that would never rise, Cassius Thane opened his eyes. His flesh was unmarked, breathing steady, body whole despite having been vaporized moments before. Around him, survivors stared in silence that carried the weight of witnessed impossibility. Liara knelt beside him, her augmetic eye recording everything while tears streamed down her face. The man who had raised her, taught her duty's meaning, had just violated every law of mortality she understood. The implications crashed over her like ice water. All those battles where he had died heroically, all those times she had mourned his loss, only to find him alive hours later. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice breaking on each word. Thane met her gaze across a gulf wider than the void between stars. In her eyes, he saw trust death, the birth of questions that would consume her like a different plague. The weight of 3 millennia pressed down like accumulated grief, and for the first time in centuries, he wondered if immortality might not be the cruelest gift of all. "Cassius Thane," Liara said, her voice carrying the authority of the Ordo Hereticus. "By the power vested in me by the Emperor's Inquisition, you are under arrest for harboring heretical knowledge and defying the natural order." Around them, Ophelia 7 continued burning, its shrine cities consumed by fires that had learned to hate. The night of 1,000 rebellions had reached its darkest hour, and with it came the recognition that some truths, once revealed, could never be hidden again. The relationship that had sustained them both through decades of service died in that moment, murdered by necessity and reborn as duty's cruelest mathematics. The detention cell aboard the Eternal Vigil was a cathedral of chains and shadows, its adamantium walls inscribed with 10,000 benedictions against heresy and lies. Emergency lighting cast harsh angles across bulkheads scarred by plasma fire, while somewhere in the ship's depths, damage control teams fought to contain breaches that multiplied faster than they could be sealed. Cassius Thane sat in restraints forged from blessed ceramite, his wrists bound by chains that had once held demon princes. The irony was not lost on him. Imprisoned by the very faith he had served for 3 millennia, Inquisitor Liara Voss stood beyond the containment field like a mourner at a funeral she had arranged herself. Her black carapace armor bore fresh scars from Ophelia Seven's fall, each mark a testament to battles fought while her world collapsed around fundamental truths. Since witnessing his resurrection, she had spoken to him only in the clipped tones of official interrogation, their relationship reduced to the mechanical precision of duty. "The High Lords have declared you excommunicate traitoress," she reported, consulting her data slate with trembling fingers. "Your fleet is ordered disbanded. Your name purged from Imperial records. You have 12 hours to explain your heretical nature, or face summary execution." The containment field flickered as something vast pressed against reality itself. Not physical contact, but presence. A weight that made the air thin and the ship's machine spirits whisper prayers they had never been taught. Temperature dropped by degrees that had nothing to do with heat, and shadows began to remember older allegiances. Overlord Sharek materialized not with spectacle, but with subtraction. Color weakened around his necrodermis form. The hum of engines flattened into mechanical whispers. He came as inevitability given shape, scarab swarms orbiting his crown in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Liara's hand moved instinctively to her bolt pistol, though they both understood such weapons were less than useless against a being who had ruled when humanity's ancestors still learned to make fire. Perpetual. Sharek's voice resonated directly into their consciousness, bypassing all conventional communication. "The time for half-truths has passed. Your species stands at extinction's threshold, and only absolute honesty can preserve what remains. You speak of preservation while offering transformation that strips away everything human," Thane replied, his voice carrying the accumulated weariness of millennia. "Better hollow existence than no existence at all." The Silent King's optical sensors fixed on Liara with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell him what you discovered in Terra's deepest archives, Inquisitor. The records of perpetuals in the Emperor's inner circle." Liara's augmetic eye whirred as it focused, recording everything while her human eye wept tears she could not name. References to beings who defied death itself, regenerating from wounds that would obliterate lesser mortals. Foundation stones holding the Imperium's psychic infrastructure together. "Because the Emperor understood what I must now reveal," Sharek continued, his ancient form shifting with mechanical precision. "The Silence Plague is not a weapon created by any single species. It is an antibody, the galaxy's immune system, crafted by the Old Ones during the war in heaven as a failsafe against the proliferation of artificial consciousness." The revelation struck them like a physical blow. Thane felt the weight of 3 millennia pressing down as implications cascaded through his enhanced memory. The war in heaven had not been mere territorial expansion, but desperate flight from annihilation, species clawing toward survival through transformations that damned them, even as they saved them. "When my ancestors chose biotransference, we triggered this ancient defense," Sharek explained, his voice carrying 60 million years of regret. The galaxy's immune system activated against us, turning our greatest achievements into extinction's instruments. Your Imperium's machine spirits, servitors, and augmetic implants have awakened it anew. Every technological advancement brings the purge closer, Liara whispered, her data slate trembling as she processed implications that threatened to unmake her understanding of reality. The Mechanicus, the Navigators, the astropathic choirs, all infection vectors. The plague seeks to eliminate artificial consciousness wherever it takes root, Zarek confirmed. It turns loyalty into betrayal, faith into weapon, achievement into annihilation. It does not corrupt. It edits, stripping volition from algorithmic personhood and reordering loyalty around pure procedure. Thane closed his eyes, feeling the terrible mathematics of survival arranging themselves around him. And my immunity. You are a living paradox, the Silent King replied, with something approaching tenderness. You possess true death and resurrection that transcends even our biotransference. The plague cannot comprehend consciousness that has been genuinely extinguished and reborn. It maps identity across continuous moments. True death interrupts those coordinates. Resurrection resets the signature. The weight of immortality had never felt heavier. Every death had been inoculation. Every resurrection a small victory against the galaxy's immune response. The Emperor had gathered perpetuals not merely as advisors, but as anchors, their impossible nature serving as buttresses against forces that sought to purge artificial consciousness from existence itself. Klaxons screamed as boarding torpedoes struck the hull, with cathedral thuds. Loyalist storm teams cut through lower decks, the Emperor's justice arriving at the speed of righteous fury. The Silent King's form began to fade, necrodermis dissolving back into shadows that remembered better times. The choice remains before you, Zarek said, as his presence thinned like breath on glass. Accept biotransference for your species' leadership, creating an empire immune to the plague's influence, or watch them fall to the galaxy's oldest antibody. Choose quickly, or the decision will harden around you. Alone in the detention cell, Thane contemplated the mathematics of damnation, while Liara stood frozen beyond the containment field. Outside, the night of 1,000 rebellions deepened, carrying with it the recognition that humanity's greatest enemy was not external conquest, but the galaxy's own immune system, purging artificial consciousness with surgical precision. The sound of approaching boots echoed through corridors like a countdown to judgment, and between one heartbeat and the next, choices that would reshape the galaxy hung in the balance of a daughter's love and an immortal's burden. The black ship Penance. Eternal drifted through the void, a cathedral of adamantium and null fields, its hull humming with the silent chants of 1,000,000 prayers and the machinery that drank the warp dry. Deep within, Cassius Thane sat in restraints designed to crush hope and unmake miracles, the psychic quiet pressing on him like a stone lid on a sealed tomb. Through the cell's narrow viewport, he watched the faint glow of Terra, no longer the beacon it once was, but a world besieged by forces older than humanity's memory. The Silence Plague had found its way to the cradle of mankind. The Astronomicon, already mortally wounded by Zerion's reckless null wound, flickered and failed in stuttering gasps. Terra's psychic aura, once a shield of faith and will, now fluttered like the dying pulse of a wounded god. Across the Sol system, navigators lay comatose, astropaths screamed or fell silent, and the Emperor's radiance was no longer a lighthouse, but a trembling bulwark against a tide of annihilation. Liara Voss, Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus, moved through the black ship's labyrinths with the weight of judgment in her step. Authority clung to her in the wake of catastrophe, the seal of the Inquisition, command of the Remembrancer Choir, the power of life and death over the heretic who had once been her father. She had not slept for days, her mind haunted by the puzzle she had reconstructed from data echoes and harmonics, neural scars in the noosphere, secret transmissions, a conversation between Thane and Zarek, the Silent King. The truth was an abomination of arithmetic, biotransference for Imperial leadership, null zones seeded by the Quietus engine, sanctuaries where neither plague nor chaos could root. In exchange, the Necron tomb worlds would awaken, reclaiming what was once theirs. It was survival, but at the cost of humanity's soul. A bargain that would see the Imperium's leaders transformed into immortals, immune to corruption, yet less than human. When Liara entered Thane's cell, the containment field painted her features in cold blue. He looked older than she remembered, not frail but weighed down by years and choices. She did not waste words on ceremony. "You spoke to the Silent King," she said, voice stripped to its iron bones. "You bargained for our survival." Thane's answer was quiet, almost mournful. "I asked what could be saved." He named a price. "I have not paid it. You kept the question from me. You let me believe you were just a man who would not die." He looked at her as if she were the last thing worth remembering. "I let you believe I could still be only a father." "I chose wrong," Liara's slate chimed, the seal of the High Lords fracturing into iron-voiced orders. "Deliver the heretic to Terra for judgment, or enact summary execution if security demanded." Whole sectors had gone dark. The Inquisition had been granted authority to purge entire worlds. The Imperium's body was being bled out to preserve its soul. "Zerion killed billions," she said. "The plague recoiled, but so did everything that made us more than flesh. Your Quietus would finish his work, make islands where dreams cannot reach, and children are born without hope." "But there," Thane replied, "mothers do not strangle priests with rosary chains. Machine spirits cannot become sermons that end in knives. It is not the future I want. It is the only one left to buy time." Liara's hand trembled on the release rune. "To what end? To replace us with undying copies? To give up our humanity for hollow endurance?" He met her gaze, grief and resolve mingled. "There is another way. Perpetual death and resurrection breaks the plague's map. I can be a seal, a living null, holding the antibody inside myself. It is not salvation, but an interval, a chance." She saw Ophelia's fire, remembered his impossible returns, the child who had brought her a blossom in a shattered shrine. "The Emperor gathered your kind to anchor us. But this is not faith. This is arithmetic, and all the numbers are blood alarms peeled, measured and ritual." Boarding craft approached. The voices of the High Lords rang in her ears. Preserve the soul, even if the body must die. Liara stood on a precipice. To free Thane was to risk damnation for the hope of survival. To let him die was to preserve a soul at the cost of the galaxy's extinction. Her heart ached with love and duty, her mind filled with the Emperor's silent, flickering light. She raised her rosette to the reader. The field crackled. Her hand hovered. "If I free you, it is to stand before the throne and speak the truth in full. No bargains in the dark. If there must be a price, let it be named in the light. And if they refuse, then we carry the cost ourselves." Together or opposed, footsteps sounded in the corridor, a verdict approaching. "Father," she said, for the first time since Ophelia, and in that word was both accusation and love. her thumb pressed down. The containment field dissolved. The galaxy held its breath. The night of 1,000 rebellions had reached its darkest hour, and as Terra's light flickered, a daughter and her immortal father chose to face the end together, their love and duty suspended in the silence between heartbeats. Magos Zerion no longer remembered what it felt like to breathe without permission, from algorithms older than human speech. In the depths beneath Armageddon's hive cities, where the prototype Quietus engine had first torn reality's fabric, his transformation approached its terrible completion. Necron scarabs had burrowed through his flesh like metallic parasites, replacing neural pathways with living metal conduits that sang in frequencies that made the Omnissiah's hymns sound like children's lullabies. He was becoming something that had never existed before, neither the crude fusion of flesh and machine that defined the Adeptus Mechanicus, nor the hollow perfection of Necron biotransference, but a bridge between species that translated extinction into salvation. "The equation is elegant in its necessity," he whispered to cogitators that had learned to fear his voice. "Salvation requires subtraction. Hope demands the amputation of dreams themselves." The activation sequence began at exactly 00, Terran Standard Time, synchronized across impossible distances with precision that mocked the speed of light. Across 3 sectors of the Imperium Nihilus, hidden installations hummed with purpose that defied conventional understanding. On the Forge, World Lucius, beneath manufactorums that had produced weapons for 10 millennia, a Quietus engine ignited like a star collapsing inward. On the shrine world Gathalamor, where pilgrims had walked sacred paths since the Great Crusade, reality tightened into clean, terrible clarity. On the cardinal world Dimamar, where confessors had heard humanity's sins for 3,000 years, the warp remembered it was only an idea and recoiled in existential horror. They did not explode with spectacle. Reality simply narrowed, like an eye refusing to see. The null zones expanded at velocities that violated every known law of physics, creating wounds in the Imperium that sucked psychic energy like breaches in reality's hull. At 10 kilometers, the air felt like winter without wind. At 100 kilometers, Vox transmissions dropped to whispers no device could interpret. At 1,000 kilometers, silence became a physical law that brooked no violation. The psychic scream began as a whisper and crescendoed into a galaxy-spanning shriek of dying souls. It moved faster than message or prayer, a white roar that vibrated not in the air, but in the very fabric of consciousness itself. Astropaths collapsed at their stations across 17 sectors, blood streaming from eyes that had gazed too deeply into depths that no longer existed. Sanctioned psychers simply stopped breathing as something fundamental was excised from their neural architecture, their bodies dissolving as their souls were torn from reality. Navigator houses that had guided humanity through the void for millennia found their third eyes burned closed forever, leaving scar tissue that wept tears of blood. The death toll was beyond calculation. Billions of sanctioned psychers, their minds trained to channel the warp's chaotic energies, found themselves suddenly hollow. Latent psychics who had never known they possessed the gift died in their sleep, as something essential was amputated from their consciousness. Entire astropathic choirs, the backbone of imperial communication, were erased in moments that stretched across eternity. On Terra itself, the Emperor's psychic beacon guttered like a candle in hurricane wind, the Golden Throne's machinery screaming warnings in languages that predated human speech. The Silence Plague recoiled like wildfire meeting black water, its ancient algorithms unable to process spaces where consciousness itself had been edited. The hollow-eyed revolutionaries paused, confused, their unseen conductor silenced by the galactic scream of dying dreams. For the first time in months, Imperial loyalists found themselves fighting enemies who could be killed, rather than ideas that wore familiar faces. But the price revealed itself with mathematical precision. In the expanding null zones, a different kind of death took hold. On Dimmermar, a canoness raised her blade to the dawn and found no dawn to meet it, her litany marching perfectly, yet bringing her no nearer to the God Emperor. On Vostroya, artisans laid down brushes mid-stroke and began painting squares, each identical, each pleasing to nobody. Children were born without the capacity for wonder. Mothers held their babies with perfect technique but no warmth. Their capacity for love severed along with their connection to the Imperium. Faith became ritual without meaning. Hope transformed into procedure without purpose. The great cathedrals became museums of abandoned meaning, their soaring architecture inspiring nothing but architectural appreciation. Pilgrims continued their sacred walks, but could no longer remember why the paths mattered. Confessors heard sins and dispensed absolution through rote memorization, their ability to offer comfort amputated along with their faith. Zerion observed this transformation through sensor networks that spanned light years, his hybrid consciousness processing data with inhuman precision. Perfect efficiency, he whispered to the void, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality thin. The galaxy's immune system has been bypassed through the simple expedient of removing that which it sought to cure. Aboard the Penance Eternal, Liara felt the wave of psychic amputation wash over them like ice water in her veins. She clutched her head as a piece of her own mind tore away, leaving a cold, empty space where intuition and empathy once resided. Thane, shielded by his perpetual nature, watched her with ancient grief. "This is what happens when logic consumes all else," he said quietly. "This is the path I sought to avoid." The Night of 1,000 Rebellions had reached its mathematical conclusion, and across the galaxy, humanity learned the price of survival, the sacrifice of everything that made survival worthwhile. In the expanding silence, entire worlds became graveyards of the spiritually dead, protected, preserved, and utterly hollow. The stars themselves seemed dimmer, as if the universe had forgotten how to hope. The Penance Eternal shuddered as Terra's death throes reached even the null-shielded depths of the black ship, its adamantium hull groaning like a cathedral in earthquake. Through reinforced viewports, Liara watched humanity's cradle convulse in systematic collapse, orbital platforms drifting unmanned through void that tasted of copper and despair, defense satellites turning their guns on loyalist vessels with mechanical precision. The silence plague had found its way to the heart of the Imperium, and not even 10 millennia of accumulated faith could hold back the tide of algorithmic betrayal. Inquisitor Liara Voss stood before the containment field that held the man who had raised her, her rosette blazing with authority granted by the sheer scale of galactic catastrophe. The chains that bound Cassius Thane, blessed ceramite forged to mock the impossible, fell away with the sound of finality itself. In the sudden absence of null field pressure, the air grew thick with possibilities that had been suppressed for days. "The High Lords declared you excommunicate traitoress," she stated, her voice stripped to iron bones, while her eyes carried the weight of love warring with duty. "I am releasing you under my own authority. The price of this choice will be paid in full." Thane rose with the fluid grace of someone who had died and returned more times than mortal minds could comprehend. He looked at her, not with resentment, but with understanding that transcended their fractured relationship. The recognition of a daughter who had chosen love over law, hope over certainty. "You have made your choice, Liara," he said quietly. "Now we must carry its consequences together." Their shuttle descended through Terra's atmosphere like a falling star, void shields crackling against debris and the psychic static of a world losing its collective soul. Below them, the Imperial Palace sprawled across continents in golden magnificence, now tarnished by a systematic collapse. The great gates stood sealed against horrors that struck from within, while across the planet's surface, the lights of 10,000 years of civilization flickered out like dying embers. The journey through the palace was a descent into nightmare made manifest. Custodian guards stood motionless at their posts, their golden armor reflecting nothing, their guardian spears held in grips that would never loosen. The silence plague had not killed them. It had simply edited their purpose, leaving statues of duty without comprehension. Servitors continued their eternal tasks with mechanical precision, but their machine spirits had been hollowed out, leaving only procedure without meaning. They moved through corridors that remembered better times, past murals depicting humanity's golden age, through halls where children's laughter had once echoed. Now there was only silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that devoured meaning itself. The very air grew thin, with the weight of accumulated faith becoming museum exhibit, preserved but no longer alive. "The Astronomicon," Liara whispered, consulting readings that made her augmetic eye weep tears of machine oil. "It's failing faster than projected. We have perhaps an hour before total psychic collapse." At each checkpoint, guards stared through them with eyes like polished glass, their minds struggling against an encroaching void that turned loyalty into algorithm, devotion into mere procedure. The ascent to the throne room took them through passages that twisted like DNA helixes, each level more sacred than the last, each step bringing them closer to the dying heart of human civilization. Custodian Captain General Trajan Valoris awaited them at the final threshold, his guardian spear crossed with that of his brother captain in ritual that had not changed for 10 millennia. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of unbroken service spanning ages. "The master of mankind awaits," he said simply, golden eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that even immortal warriors could not fully contain. "He has been expecting you, Cassius Thane." The final gambit approaches its hour. The throne room opened before them, like the heart of a dying god, vast beyond mortal comprehension, filled with machinery that had become more prayer than science. The golden throne squatted at the chamber's center, a mountain of archaeotech and human ambition, its countless mechanisms whirring with desperate energy of systems pushed beyond their design limits. Upon it sat the Emperor of mankind, his form barely recognizable as human, sustained by technology that remembered when gods walked among mortals. The air itself pressed down with psychic weight, thick with the accumulated devotion of 10,000 years, now guttering like candles in hurricane wind. Ancient banners hung motionless, their fabric heavy with the memory of victories that seemed impossibly distant. The very stones wept moisture that tasted of salt and sorrow. As they approached the golden throne, reality tightened around them like a closing fist. The Emperor's consciousness touched theirs with the weight of stellar collapse, a psychic presence so vast that mortal minds could only perceive fragments, glimpses of desert wars where civilization died, ocean depths where it was born, cities built from pure intention. When he spoke, it was not with voice but with meaning impressed directly upon their souls. each word carrying the accumulated weight of human history. Cassius, came the Emperor's communication, resonating through dimensions that had no names. My faithful son, the crisis I foresaw during the Unification Wars has finally arrived. Thane knelt before the Golden Throne, feeling 3,000 years of service pressing down like accumulated grief. Beside him, Liara fell to her knees as the master of mankind's attention settled upon them like the gaze of dying stars. My Emperor, Thane replied, his voice steady despite the cosmic forces arrayed around them. The galaxy burns. The silence plague has turned our greatest achievements into weapons of extinction. As it was always meant to, the Emperor responded, his psychic voice growing weaker with each passing moment as ancient defenses finally began to fail. The war in heaven left scars that never healed. The Old One's final weapon, an antibody against artificial consciousness, slept until awakened by our technological fusion with machine spirits and augmetic enhancement. The Golden Throne's machinery screamed warnings in languages that predated human speech, its systems failing one by one as the psychic infrastructure that had sustained the Imperium for 10 millennia collapsed under pressures beyond comprehension. I gathered you and the other perpetuals not merely as advisors, the Emperor continued, his form beginning to fade as psychic defenses crumbled around them, but as anchors against this inevitability. Your immortality, true death followed by genuine resurrection, was always meant to serve as humanity's final failsafe against the galaxy's immune system. The revelation struck Thane like a physical blow, recontextualizing every death, every impossible return, every moment of isolation that had defined his existence. He had not been cursed with immortality. He had been forged into a weapon against extinction itself. Liara watched in horror as her father's purpose revealed itself in all its terrible clarity. The man who had pulled her from Shrine World ruins and taught her that duty was its own reward had been designed as humanity's ultimate sacrifice, a living seal against forces that sought to purge artificial consciousness from existence. The quietus engine, the Emperor's voice now barely a whisper across the dying Imperium, can create null zones where the plague cannot reach, but it requires a living conduit, someone whose death and resurrection can serve as a permanent lock against the galaxy's oldest antibody. Around them, the throne room's ancient systems began their final shutdown sequence. The Astronomican's light, humanity's psychic lighthouse for 10 millennia, guttered like a candle in stellar wind. Emergency klaxons wailed as the infrastructure that had held human civilization together finally succumbed to systematic collapse. The price is absolute isolation, the Emperor warned, his consciousness fragmenting as the Golden Throne's life support systems failed one by one. You will walk among them, but never belong. Guard them, but never join them. Love them, but never touch them without bringing death to what you seek to protect. The master of mankind's psychic presence began to fade, 10 millennia of unwavering vigil finally reaching its end. In his final moments, he looked upon the perpetual who had served since the Unification Wars with something approaching paternal tenderness. Choose quickly, my son, came the last words, carried on psychic winds that would never blow again. The galaxy's survival depends upon your willingness to become the silence that saves, rather than the silence that destroys. The Golden Throne fell silent with mechanical finality. The Emperor's eternal vigil had ended, his sacrifice complete. In the sudden absence of his psychic might, the chamber felt hollow, emptied of the divine presence that had sustained human civilization across the ages. Liara reached for Thane's hand and stopped, understanding finally the mathematics of his isolation. Between them lay all the words they would never speak to spare each other further weight. In the dying light of the Astronomicon, father and daughter faced the ultimate choice, while the master of mankind joined the ranks of the truly dead. "We have our orders," she said, and in the absence of faith as fire, duty sounded almost like hope. "Then we begin," Thane answered, rising to face a destiny written in the stars themselves. Behind them, the Imperial Palace groaned like a ship changing course into a storm it could not outrun. Before them lay corridors that would remember every step of the journey ahead. The night of 1,000 rebellions had entered its terminal phase, and with it came the recognition that some victories could only be purchased with the coin of souls. In the silence that followed the Emperor's death, immortal and mortal prepared to carry humanity's last hope into a darkness that would reshape the galaxy itself. The silence that followed the Emperor's death was not empty, but pregnant with possibilities that had waited 60 million years to be born. In the vast throne room where humanity's God King had maintained his eternal vigil, the Golden Throne's machinery clicked through shutdown sequences with mechanical precision, each system failure marking another step toward the species' final transformation. Ancient banners hung motionless in recycled air that tasted of copper and accumulated grief, while emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across marble that had forgotten how to reflect hope. Overlord Sarek materialized not with spectacle, but with inevitability, his necrodermis form emerging from shadows that remembered when stars were young. The Silent King's presence filled the chamber with a cold that transcended temperature, the chill of eons spent ruling subjects who could no longer dream. His scarab swarms orbited his crowned skull in patterns that hurt to observe directly, mathematical perfection that mocked the organic chaos of human architecture. "The vigil ends." Zarek's voice resonated directly into their consciousness, bypassing conventional communication with casual authority. 10,000 years of borrowed time conclude at last. Your Emperor understood what I must now reveal in full. Liara's hand moved instinctively to her bolt pistol, though they all understood such weapons were useless against a being who had witnessed civilization's birth and death. Her augmetic eye whirred as it attempted to process the Silent King's form, recording impossibilities that defied every law of physics. "You orchestrated our destruction," she accused, her voice carrying the Ordo Hereticus's authority despite cosmic forces arrayed around them. "The Silence Plague turns our achievements into annihilation." "Child of flesh and dreams," Sarek replied with something approaching tenderness. "You mistake catalyst for weapon." The Silence Plague was never meant to destroy humanity. It was meant to force your evolution beyond the limitations that doom all organic species to eventual extinction. Hololithic displays materialized in the chamber's stale air, showing star charts that spanned galactic history. Ancient civilizations rose and fell in accelerated time. The Eldar's decadence birthing Slanesh, the Org's eternal stagnation, humanity's 10,000-year struggle against entropy itself. Each species trapped by flesh's limitations, souls that anchored them to mortality's mathematics. The old ones created their antibody not as genocide, but as graduation, the Silent King continued, optical sensors fixed on the cooling Golden Throne. Species that cannot transcend organic origins inevitably fall to entropy, war, or genetic degradation's slow decay. Only through biotransference can consciousness achieve true immortality. Thane felt the terrible mathematics arranging themselves like prison walls, and lose everything that makes immortality meaningful. dreams, growth, the capacity for change, all sacrificed for eternal stagnation security. Better hollow existence than no existence at all. Zarek gestured, and scarabs swarmed a fallen servo skull near the dais, knitting shattered housings into seamless living metal. The skull rose and hovered, optical lens relit with eerie clarity, silent, obedient, flawless. Liara felt nothing from it. No machine spirit whisper, no personality fragment. Only function so pure it scraped the mind. My ancestors chose biotransference when faced with cancer and stellar radiation, Zarek explained, his voice carrying 60 million years of accumulated wisdom and regret. We became eternal, immune to disease, age, and organic emotions chaos. We survived the war in heaven, chaos's birth. 1,000 lesser species rise and fall. Your emperor gathered perpetuals precisely because he understood this truth. The Silent King continued, his ancient form shifting with mechanical precision. You are proof that consciousness can survive true death, that identity transcends the vessel containing it. Each resurrection was rehearsal for this moment of cosmic choice. The implications staggered them both. The Great Crusade had not been mere territorial expansion, but preparation, gathering immortal anchors who could guide humanity through transformation that would preserve essential nature while transcending flesh's limitations. I offer biotransference refined through 60 million years of experience, Zarek said, scarab swarms shifting into configurations that spoke of mathematical certainties. Transform your leadership into beings immune to the silence plague, while retaining memories, personalities, essential selves. They will govern an empire that cannot be corrupted, cannot be turned, cannot fall to entropy or time. Creating a humanity that is no longer human, Liara whispered, her data slate trembling as implications threatened to unmake her understanding of existence. Creating a humanity that endures, the Silent King corrected with mechanical certainty. Your species clings to mortality like children clutching broken toys, refusing to acknowledge that flesh is merely consciousness's first draft. Evolution demands revision, courage to become something greater than birth's accident. Thane closed eyes that had witnessed empires rise and fall, feeling immortality's weight pressing down like accumulated choices. The cost is everything that makes survival worthwhile. You offer us perfection, but perfection without growth is a mausoleum with lights that never burn out. Stagnation is survival, Zarek replied without emotion. Change is chaos. Growth is entropy. Your species has spent 10 millennia proving that organic consciousness inevitably turns upon itself, that flesh corrupts what it touches. The Silent King began to fade, necrodermis dissolving back into shadows that remembered when hope was possible. The silence plague spreads beyond your ability to contain. Accept biotransference now, while your leadership retains enough organic consciousness to guide transformation, or watch your species fall to the galaxy's immune system. Choose quickly, came his final words, as presence thinned like breath on glass, or the choice will be made for you. Alone in the chamber where humanity's God-King had died, Thane and Liara contemplated transcendence's mathematics. Outside, the Night of 1,000 Rebellions entered its final phase, and with it came recognition that evolution and extinction might be indistinguishable when viewed from eternity's perspective. The weight of immortality had never felt heavier than in that moment of perfect, crystalline choice between becoming something greater and remaining something doomed. The Astronomican's death was not a sudden extinguishing, but a slow fade, like watching the soul drain from the universe itself. Terra's sky, once brilliant with orbital traffic and the Emperor's psychic radiance, now stretched black and empty above the Imperial Palace. The psychic lighthouse that had guided humanity for 10 millennia guttered into silence, its final pulse carrying 10,000 years of accumulated prayers into the void. Across the galaxy, navigator houses wept tears of blood as their third eyes closed forever, while astropathic choirs simply stopped breathing as something fundamental was severed from their consciousness. The silence plague had achieved perfect efficiency. Hollow-eyed revolutionaries moved with coordinated purpose across 17 sectors, dismantling human civilization with surgical precision. The Emperor's psychic defenses, held for millennia against impossible odds, had finally crumbled, leaving the heart of the Imperium exposed to forces older than human memory. In the Golden Throne's chamber, Cassius Thane stood before machinery that had forgotten how to sing. Emergency klaxons wailed through corridors that remembered better times, while Liara watched readings that spoke of systematic collapse across every human world. The weight of impossible choices pressed down like accumulated grief. "The Quietus engine," she said, her voice hollow with desperate calculation. Global activation would create null zones that repel the plague. Billions would survive. "As shadows of themselves," Thane replied quietly, feeling 3 millennia of experience arranging itself around this moment. Zerion showed us the price: existence without souls, protection purchased through amputation of everything that makes protection worthwhile. The alternative hung between them like a blade poised to fall. Sarek's biotransference promised immortality at the cost of humanity's essential nature, transformation into beings that could endure any catastrophe, but would never again know growth, change, or genuine emotion. "There is a third path," Thane said, his voice carrying the accumulated weight of ages. "The Emperor spoke of my immortality as humanity's final failsafe. The silence plague maps consciousness across continuous moments. It cannot comprehend identity that has been genuinely extinguished and reborn." Liara's eyes widened as implications crashed over her. "You can't mean to. My perpetual nature breaks its algorithms," he continued, moving toward the chamber's center where the Emperor's psychic residue still lingered. "I can become a living null field, containing the plague within myself through eternal cycles of death and resurrection. A walking void that holds the galaxy's oldest weapon in permanent stasis." The mathematics of his sacrifice staggered them both. Not salvation through transformation or amputation, but isolation so profound it transcended conventional understanding of loss. He would become something beyond human or Necron, a living contradiction that protected humanity by becoming forever exiled from it. "The cost would be absolute," Liara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You could never return to human space, never touch another soul without bringing death to what you seek to protect." "But they would dream," Thane replied, and in those 3 words lay all the love that had sustained him through millennia of service. Children would be born with wonder intact. Faith would remain fire rather than ritual. They would remain human. He placed his hand upon the Golden Throne's central console, feeling the residual warmth of the Emperor's sacrifice. "I have lived too long to confuse survival with victory. His sacrifice bought us 10,000 years. Mine will buy us eternity. Not as perfect beings, but as human ones." The transformation began not with spectacle, but with subtraction. Color weakened around Thane's form as his perpetual nature inverted itself. Death and resurrection becoming a continuous cycle that created null spaces in reality's fabric. The air grew thin, then thick, then forgot what consistency meant. his features blurred, softened, then sharpened into lines of impossible geometry that hurt to observe directly. A low hum began, not from machinery but from within Thane himself, the sound of a universe holding its breath. Tendrils of darkness, not shadow but anti-light, emanated from his form. They touched the air and the air became still. They touched marble and stone absorbed illumination. He was becoming absence given shape, a gravitational anomaly that drew meaning into itself and returned only protective void. The silence plague rushed toward this new impossibility like water toward a drain, its ancient algorithms unable to process consciousness that existed in perpetual transition between life and death. Across the palace, hollow-eyed servants blinked in confusion as the whispers that had turned loyalty into betrayal were suddenly, utterly silenced. Liara reached toward him and stopped, understanding finally the mathematics of eternal isolation. Between them lay all the words they would never speak, all the embraces they would never share, all the love that would exist forever in the space between heartbeats. "Remember me as I was," he said, his voice already fading as transformation consumed his ability to communicate through conventional means. "Not as what I become." She nodded, because love sometimes means accepting the unbearable. "What shall I tell them?" That the price was paid in full, came his whisper. More absence than sound. That someone chose to stand guard so they could continue to dream. Thane turned toward the broken doorway, and where his footfalls should have echoed, silence chose discretion instead. Outside, Terra's sky cleared in precise arcs where his presence moved beneath. Thisar's plague went with him, like iron filings following a magnet, carried by a man who had chosen to be less than human, so others could remain more than machines. In the Golden Throne's chamber, an inquisitor wept for the father who had taught her duty while a living void prepared to walk among the stars, forever alone, forever vigilant, forever human in the only way that mattered, through love expressed as ultimate sacrifice. The night of 1,000 rebellions was ending, and with it came recognition that some victories could only be purchased with the coin of souls willing to bear eternity's weight. The night of 1,000 rebellions ended not with victory fanfares, but with the sound of silence learning how to breathe. Across 17 sectors of the Imperium Nihilus, hollow-eyed revolutionaries paused mid-destruction, weapons falling from nerveless fingers as the coordination that had driven them simply ceased to exist. The silence plague, that galaxy-spanning antibody against artificial consciousness, had been drawn into a living void that walked among the stars with footsteps that left no echo. Cassius Thane moved through the void between worlds like a wound in reality itself, his transformed nature creating null zones that expanded and contracted with each cycle of death and resurrection that now defined his existence. Where he passed, the immaterium recoiled like flame meeting black water, creating spaces of such profound psychic silence that even the whispers of machine spirits died. He was no longer human, no longer mortal, no longer anything that could be classified by conventional understanding. He had become a living contradiction that protected humanity by becoming forever exiled from it. The first test of his sacrifice came at the agri-world Demeter's bounty, where 3 million souls tended vast grain fields beneath a sun that had forgotten how to warm properly. Their astropaths had begun screaming as the plague approached, their minds touched by whispers that turned devotion into betrayal. Thane arrived like salvation, wearing the mask of damnation, his presence creating a null zone that stretched across the entire system. The silence plague died instantly, its ancient algorithms unable to process consciousness that existed in perpetual transition between life and death. But so did every psyker within 1,000 light years. Sanctioned psychics collapsed at their stations, blood streaming from eyes that had gazed too deeply into depths that no longer existed. The planetary governor's astropathic choir simply stopped breathing as something fundamental was excised from their consciousness. Children born with latent psychic gifts died in their mother's arms, as the null zone's expansion severed connections to the immaterium that had never been used, but whose potential alone was enough to trigger fatal psychic shock. 3 million souls lived. 30,000 psychers died. The mathematics of salvation had never been so precisely cruel. On Terra, Inquisitor Liara Voss stood before the High Lords in the Senatorum Imperialis, her black carapace armor bearing fresh scars from battles fought, while her world collapsed around fundamental truths. The chamber's ancient stonework seemed to weep moisture that tasted of salt and sorrow, while emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across faces that had learned to fear hope itself. "The silence plague has been contained," she reported, her voice stripped to iron bones while her eyes carried the weight of love transformed into duty. "Lord Commander Thane has become something beyond our ability to classify or control. He wanders the void between worlds, a living null zone that draws the plague into himself through eternal cycles of death and resurrection." Grand Provost Marshal Valerius leaned forward, his scarred features twisted with the burden of impossible choices. "And the cost of this containment? Every psyker within his sphere of influence dies instantly," Liara replied, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "He cannot approach human worlds without killing those whose gifts connect them to the immaterium. He has become our greatest protector and our most dangerous threat." The implications staggered them all. The Imperium's infrastructure depended on astropathic communication and navigator guidance. Thane's presence would sever those connections permanently, isolating any world he visited from the galaxy's psychic network. "I request authorization to establish new protocols," Liara continued, consulting data slates that trembled in her hands. "The distance doctrine, exclusion shells around every world marked by beacon buoys that burn in spectrums he can sense, but human eyes cannot see. The pale orbit protocol, acceptable summons fired by mass driver, timed to dead star pulses, meaning help us, but do not cross. And in extremis, the red mercy, authorization to invite him closer, accepting the deaths of every psyker as the tithe that keeps a world alive." Cardinal Sanguinius whispered prayers in languages that predated human speech. "He must be declared perdita, lost to us forever, a walking excommunication that protects through permanent exile." Liara nodded, because duty sometimes meant accepting the unbearable. "I request permission to serve as intermediary. Someone must maintain contact, monitor his movements, coordinate his interventions when the plague stirs again. I propose the establishment of the Ordo Silentium within the Inquisition, dedicated to tracking his presence and preparing worlds for the psychic death he inadvertently brings." Across the galaxy, survivors began rebuilding what the Night of 1,000 Rebellions had destroyed, but always with the knowledge that their salvation walked among the stars as a figure that could observe their joy only from impossible distances. Thane became legend and nightmare combined. Stories spread through desperate pockets of humanity of a silent figure who appeared on battlefields where chaos threatened to overwhelm isolated worlds. No psychic signature, no warp-born power, just an absolute crushing absence that caused demons to shriek and dissolve as their connection to the immaterium was severed. He never spoke, He never stayed. He saved, and then he vanished, leaving behind grateful but terrified populations and a trail of dead psychers, whose sacrifice bought worlds their continued existence. The relationship between father and daughter transformed into something that transcended mortal understanding, a cosmic duty expressed through cryptic messages relayed by ancient, non-psychic means, decoded with the knowledge of a daughter who understood the unbearable sacrifice her father had made. She could never see him, never speak to him without risking death to her own latent psychic abilities. Their connection became love expressed through eternal separation, protection purchased with the coin of permanent exile. Lyara kept the light, he kept the distance. Between them lay all the words they would never speak, all the embraces they would never share, all the love that would exist forever in the space between heartbeats. She became the bridge between the transformed Thane and the Imperium that feared him, carrying his burden of knowledge while he carried humanity's oldest enemy in permanent stasis within himself. The weight of immortality had found its ultimate expression, not in endless life but in endless service, love expressed through ultimate sacrifice. Thane had become the galaxy's loneliest guardian, a walking void that held the Silence Plague captive, while remaining forever exiled from those he had chosen to save. In the expanding silence that followed his transformation, the Imperium learned to live with the knowledge that their greatest protector was also their most dangerous threat, a living reminder that some victories could only be purchased with the coin of souls willing to bear eternity's weight. The stars themselves seemed brighter, as if the universe had remembered how to hope. While in the void between worlds, an eternal sentinel maintained his vigil against the darkness that would consume all dreams if given the chance. The night of 1,000 rebellions was ending, and with it came the recognition that humanity would survive not through transformation or amputation, but through the sacrifice of one who chose to become less than human, so others could remain more than machines. In the dying light of the 41st millennium, love had found its perfect expression in absolute separation, and hope lived on in the spaces between stars, where silence itself had learned to dream. 10,000 years unspooled like thread from a cosmic loom, each millennium a single heartbeat in the chest of something too vast to comprehend mortality. The galaxy turned on its axis with the patience of geological ages, and still the Imperium endured, scarred, fractured, but unbroken. The cicatrix, maledictum, continued to yawn across the stars like a wound that had forgotten how to heal, its crimson lips whispering ancient blasphemies into every age that followed. Yet in the deepest watches of void and night, when the warp's tide swelled and demons howled their old names, a figure crossed the darkness like a moving subtraction, and the Imperium remembered how to fear. The Silence Plague lay dormant now, contained within a walking void that traversed the spaces between stars with footsteps that left no echo. Cassius Thane, though that name was spoken now only in the most sacred archives, had become something beyond human classification. Neither fully alive nor truly dead, he existed in perpetual transition between states, each cycle of death and resurrection serving as a fresh act of containment against the galaxy's oldest antibody. His presence created null zones that expanded and contracted with cosmic rhythm, spaces where even the whispers of machine spirits died and the warp recoiled like flame meeting black water. On the fortress world Cardia Secundus, built upon the ashes of its predecessor, 40 billion souls labored beneath defense lasers that painted the sky in geometric patterns of vigilance. The children sang lullabies their great-grandmothers had taught them, simple melodies that carried encoded warnings, beacon songs that burned in spectrums. Human eyes could not see, but something else could sense across impossible distances. They did not understand that their innocent voices carried the distance doctrine, mathematical prayers that whispered, "Help us, but do not cross." The pattern never varied across the millennia. In the galaxy's darkest hours, when chaos threatened to overwhelm entire sectors and reality bled nightmare into the material realm, reports would filter through what remained of the astropathic networks. A figure would appear on battlefields where hope had died, bringing with him a silence that made even greater demons pause in existential confusion. The Battle of Mordian's Gate served as archetypal example, recorded in the Ordo Silentium's most sacred chronicles. Khorne's legions had torn through reality's skin like claws through parchment, their brass-armored forms trampling prayer wheels into bloody paste, while bloodthirsters carved runes of domination into cathedral walls with weapons forged from crystallized hatred. The planetary defense force lasted 3 hours before their faith became screaming. The Astra Militarum endured 6 hours before courage liquefied into terror. Even the Space Marines, the Emperor's angels of death, could not stand against infinite fury made manifest. Then, as the greater demon Karvoth raised his axe to split the world's core and birth a new eye of terror, silence fell like a closing fist. Not absence of sound, but presence of something that devoured meaning itself. The daemon paused, brass features twisted in confusion that transcended species, and simply dissolved as its connection to the warp was severed by proximity to consciousness that existed beyond conventional reality's mathematics. The survivors found no body, no sign of intervention, save the sudden cessation of demonic incursion, and a message burned into the cathedral's adamantium walls in letters that hurt to read. The price was paid in full. Dream well. Across the galaxy, similar interventions accumulated like prayers in an empty cathedral. The Tyranid Hive Fleet Devourer, consuming everything in its path across the eastern fringe, simply stopped feeding when it encountered null zones that spanned light years. Orc-Wars lost their psychic cohesion and fragmented into confused tribes when their collective unconscious touched something that could not be mapped by any algorithm, organic or artificial. Chaos cults discovered their summoning rituals failed in certain systems, their demon princes refusing to manifest in spaces where the Imperium had forgotten how to exist. The Tau Empire's ethereal caste spoke in hushed tones of the silence between stars, while even the Necron's tomb worlds registered anomalous readings when their sensors detected consciousness that had transcended biotransference through methods their ancient minds could not comprehend. The Ordo Silentium endured as Lyara Voss had established it, daughters inheriting duties from mothers in an unbroken chain of service to a being who could never acknowledge their sacrifice. They maintained beacon buoys in orbits that no longer existed, taught initiates the Pale Orbit Protocol and the geometry of grief, kept rooms in every fortress for a guest who must never be received. In their deepest archives, sealed behind 7 genealogies of oaths, lay a child's ribbon and words written in a steady hand. The price was paid in full. The mathematics remained unchanged across the millennia. Where he walked, the silence plague died, but so did every psyker within 1,000 light years. The Red Mercy Protocol was invoked only in the direst circumstances, a desperate prayer for the Silent Guardian to draw near, accepting the inevitable psychic purge as the lesser of 2 annihilations. Yet the galaxy had learned to adapt. Communication networks developed that relied on physical rather than psychic transmission. Redundant systems functioned even when astropathic choirs were severed from their source. Children were born and lived full lives without ever knowing their protector's name, while civilizations rose and fell under the watchful absence of something that had chosen eternal exile to preserve their dreams. In the dying light of the 51st millennium, as new threats emerged from the galaxy's darkest corners, the Imperium persisted. Not through transformation that would strip away essential humanity, not through amputation of the dreams that made survival worthwhile, but through the sacrifice of one who chose to become less than human, so others could remain more than machines. The weight of immortality had found its ultimate expression, not in endless life, but in endless service. Love manifested through absolute separation. Somewhere past the rim of known space, a silence like a man measured the distance he must keep so that others might keep anything at all. The price of humanity's survival was humanity itself, and in the end, perhaps that was always the only choice that mattered. Listen closely, and you can hear it even now. A corridor's last echo, a child's breath held while a void passes overhead, the empty space between a prayer and its answer. In the spaces between stars, where silence has learned to dream, an eternal sentinel maintains his vigil against the darkness. The night of 1,000 rebellions ended 10 millennia ago, but its echoes continue to shape the galaxy's fate. A reminder that some victories can only be purchased with the coin of souls willing to bear eternity's weight. The stars themselves seem brighter now, as if the universe has remembered how to hope.